Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. Today's guest is farm boy turned priest, Father Charles Davignon. Welcome to the show, Father.
Thank you very much.
Well, I've been really
Scott.
looking forward to having you on the show because you've been on my radio show before, and although I'm not Catholic, I've heard so much about you over the years, and you know you're a Brownington farm boy turned priest.
All born in Albany, the whole crowd, and moved to Brownington when I was.
Oh, so you're actually an Albany native.
Well, by birth.
Right.
But then we became. I was only 8 years old when we came to Brownington. So
you know what's funny is I know you've told me before. One of your brothers once joked the reason you decided to go into the priesthood at such a young age, you start following, was because you wanted to get out of chores.
Well, that's one of the reasons. The other reason was I had a project with the 4-H people,
Right.
and it was a lovely little calf. And my poor calf died. And that seemed to be a sign from the Lord that maybe I shouldn't be into the farm business.
So your calf died. How did you kill it?
Well, I didn't kill it. I was supposed to be feeding it properly and doing all the proper things. But for whatever reason, my efforts never got any lasting results.
So you thought that was a message. Okay, Charles, farming's not for you. You better pick up a new vocation.
But actually, before that, when we still lived in East Albany,
Right.
We had a mission, and I was impressed by the little church, which is still there,
Right.
Open a couple of times a year.
Right.
But
Is that the one that Paul Daniels wrote about?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And he's been promoting that, of course, for many years. And
Right.
but I was impressed. My mother and father, we lived in South Albany,
Right.
and I remember walking with my mother and father from South to East Albany, which is about a 4-mile trip. I thought, this is an important part of the world, that the church would attract this family, there were 9 of us,
Yep.
to walk that distance. That the Mass had to be that important. And I think that probably from that day, I was only 7 or 8 years old. I said, I think that's something to look into.
Did you ever waver?
Once I got started,
Right.
and I was 13 years old, and Sister Bernadette said, during our vacation school down in Orleans, what are you going to do when you grow up? And I said, I'm going to be a priest. And she said, well, you have to go to school for that, you know. I said, yeah, I know that. She said, well, no, there were no bus trips from Brownington to Newport in those days.
Right.
And so she spoke with the priest, and I spoke with the local priest. And he said, it was old Father Bastion, how would you like to go to Bloomfield, Connecticut? Well, that was like saying, how would I like to go to Cairo, Egypt? I'd never been to Montpelier, I don't think. So I ended up on a midnight train to the seminary, and that was the high school years,
Right.
and then 2 years of college.
Now, how did your parents? Because at least during that period of time, within a Catholic family, wasn't it a great honor to have a child who wanted to be a priest?
It was, and it was a sacrifice for me to leave the farm, because when we moved there from Albany, we all learned to milk
Right.
by hand in those days. So they were losing a helper as well.
Right.
But if God was calling their son, in this case, did I feel that I was being called, and I did, they said, well, we've got to let him go.
Right.
But it was going to be a financial problem as well.
Right.
And I remember my mother saying, Dad we can't afford to send him to a school in Connecticut. She said, oh no, we don't have to worry about it. because that will be, once he's ordained, he'll pay that back. So the diocese will take care of it.
Right.
And the tuition, excuse me, the tuition was $320 a year, mind you.
That wouldn't even buy you, that would buy you about 2 textbooks today.
Exactly.
Oh, it costs so much more. Now, who were your parents?
Well, my father was a Canadian.
Right. And what was his name?
Leo.
Right.
Leo Javana.
Right.
Leo Davignon.
Right.
From
Yeah,
Canada.
'cause we Anglos, we kind of have changed your name on you.
So Davignon, no, we became like Kavanaugh with a D.
Right.
But it's really, it means from, the name itself, it's from Avignon, which is the city in France.
Now, and who was your mother?
My mother was a Pudvar.
Right.
She was a big family from Barton.
Right.
And she was a school teacher, Nellie. She was the oldest of 9. And her sisters, she had 3, 4 sisters who were school teachers as well.
And you were from how many children in your family?
9 of us.
Right. Yeah, I know. I ran into you and a bunch of your sisters recently, and they were having a kind of a bit of fun. They said, "Well, yeah, you don't have a wife to keep you honest, to keep you in line," but they said they did say that you have a bunch of sisters to fill that role.
Oh boy, do they ever!
But what I remember you best by, and I don't know why, it had to have been decades ago. I remember watching you on, I believe it was Channel 3, doing the morning service. And as I said, I'm not Catholic, but I always knew you were a homeboy, and so I always watched you on TV.
Oh, thank you. Well, you were a much younger man, of course.
Oh, sure I was. I was a kid.
You were a kid, because I did that television TV mass for like 10 years.
Right.
And in those days, we did it at the studio.
Right.
In Burlington.
Yeah. No, I remember that well, and I just remember, I don't know how I even knew it, but I knew that you were a homeboy. You were from the Northeast Kingdom.
A native of the...
I think I was destined. To this day, I love to know what people, who started out here, what they've done with their lives. So.
Well, certainly mine took me around the world.
Right. All right, so you started out as a child being interested, then you go to seminary. What then?
After the seminary,
Yeah.
that was 6 years in Connecticut, 6 years in Montreal, and then I was assigned by Bishop Joyce. I was ordained by Bishop Ryan.
Right.
And then I was assigned to Richford for a couple of years, and then he died the same year that I was ordained. That was 1956.
Right.
And he died that, we were ordained in April, and he died that November.
Right.
And then Bishop Joyce became the bishop. And after 2 years, Bishop Joyce sent me to the Catholic University in Washington, D.C. for further studies. And Father St. Omer said, I followed Father Gelano,
Right.
who later became Bishop Gelano. And Father St. Omer was kind of a French accent. Oh, my curates are so dumb. The bishop had to send them back to school. Father Gelano went down in canon law, and I went down in education.
Right. You mentioned Father St. Ange. I never knew him, but I know him from newspaper articles because I've been recording the history of Jay Peak.
Yes.
And he was a major mover and a shaker behind promoting Jay Peak. And there's an article where they called him, I think, the bulldozer, and because they said nothing got in his way. And I picture Father St. Ange from reading articles as being this. See how right I am. I picture him as a rather short, stout, energetic, kind of flamboyant man.
Oh, that's a good description.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was from Graniteville.
Right.
And the family was there when they were fighting, literally, with the quarries and
Right.
people. and he came from a ambitious, hard-working family. He only had one brother, but he helped he was pastor over here in Troy, and there, if the farmers had a broken rake or mowing machine or manure spreader, he had a shop and he'd help them. They'd bring it over to him, and some of the local people said, there's gold in our hills. This was at the beginning of the development of JP.
Right.
And the story was that he got 17 local investors at $1,000 each, and they went to Montpelier and said, we want to work on the development of J Peak. And they hired, and then the state, I guess, duplicated the...
Right.
And then they hired a man from Austria, Walter Foger, his name was. And I think they still have a Foger auditorium.
Yeah, they had the Foger ballroom.
Ballroom, okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So he was the manager and the ski instructor.
Right. Yeah, he was a very forceful personality in his own right.
Yes,
Walter was.
Yes, he certainly was.
So, but and I hear about these, like Father St. Ange, and then you being this homegrown boy, and then I think of a guy that is more my age is Father Royer, who's no longer up in this neck of the woods, and I think. Like people like you, people were able to connect with you because I think for numerous reasons you were homegrown, but you were not perfect. And
they certainly knew that.
Right. And the thing is I think people really enjoy people who don't pretend to be perfect. And if you're from a region, everybody, you might as well tell people your flaws because, people are going to make it up.
They're going to see them.
Right. And I just think, I look at you and Father Royer as being kind of like in the same vein of things, especially with working with people.
Well, and we came from local farms.
Right.
We were farm boys.
Right. Just a couple generations apart.
That's right. He was in high school by the time I came here to
Right.
St. Mary's as pastor. That would have been in the 80s.
Right. But so your trip then, it took you to Washington, D.C., and what did you...
And then I was assigned to Montpelier,
Right.
and principal of the Catholic high school that existed there
Right.
at that time. And I was there for 6 years. And during that time, Pope John the 23rd called upon North America to assist the South American church. And they asked for 10%, actually. Most dioceses were not able to do that, but so I offered to go. And Bishop Joyce in the beginning said no. He'd sent me off to school, and I was supposed to be running a school, and was. But anyway, after 6 years, he said, yes, if you're still interested, you may go to Latin America, which I did. That was in 1966.
So where did you go?
I went to language school first in Bolivia with the Maryknoll Fathers. Maryknoll is the Catholic Foreign Mission Society of America. And they were founded in 1911 for China as missioners.
Right.
But then when the communists took over, they jailed some of them, but many of them went off to other mission countries, to Africa, and that's when they went to Latin America. So by the time I went, they had a language school in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and I'd never heard of the place. I had studied in Canada, so I knew French. We never spoke French at home. My father spoke it, but my mother...
Oh, really?
She was partly Irish. So my Irish grandmother was still living in Barton, of course, in those days. And she was at the train when I got on. But anyway, when I went to the Latin American world and church, I spent 6 months learning Spanish, and then I was assigned to university work. I'd been in the education business, so I was assigned to university work in Lima, Peru. And I was often tempted to write to Bishop Joyce. Montpelier, I don't think to this day has over 10,000 people. But I was at a university in Lima that had over 15,000 students at the time. I thought it would have been fun to tell the bishop, you know, Bishop, thank you very much. My assignment has got me into this big city. Kind of out of my Northeast Kingdom background, really.
Yeah, because here you are, you know, you were a farm boy who, you know, as you said, you hadn't even traveled to Montpelier, and suddenly, you know, you slowly make your way to South America. and you know, you actually followed in your mother's footsteps in a way.
In the education business, that's true.
Right. So are you still, did you ever become fluent in Spanish?
Oh, yes.
Right. Have you been able to maintain it?
Unfortunately, after my 6 years down there, I came home, and we had a new bishop by then, right. Bishop Marshall. And I had worked with the communications business. And after Lima, where I was in the university,
right.
The Maryknolls had a communications project in the Altiplano, where they, among other things, had a radio station.
Now, where was that?
That was in the northern part of Peru,
right.
Up in the Andes, in a province and a city called Puno, on the northern tip of the highest navigable lake in the world. And there we had a radio and a TV and a lot of teachers. We taught the native peoples by radio. We gave them small transistor radios, and they would meet in a school or in a church or in
You
some
would teach them what,
community.
the Bible or?
All kinds of stuff.
Right.
The religion would have been one, but health and commerce, and we had like 17 teachers, and they were paid for by the government. So we were with the Ministry of Education in the project itself, which I inherited from one of the other Maryknollers. That was a fascinating open world for the first time for me. But because of my Spanish, I was able to work with the local people.
And so were these, when you were working in this facet, were these pretty primitive people?
Oh, very much so. They lived very much like they had 400 years previous, almost.
And were they receptive?
They were amazingly receptive, and open and desirous of, you know, this was a stage of ongoing development, really.
So, so from Peru, where'd you go next?
Peru, I came back to Vermont, and Bishop Marshall assigned me as Director of Communications for the diocese, and I had an office there with him. He was not the easiest man to communicate with or for. And so I went to him after a couple of years, and I said, you know, Bishop, I'm not using my Spanish very much.
Was that a way to kind of like
move out? Yeah, it sort of was. And his question was, are you going to join Maryknoll for good? Because I had permission from Bishop Joyce, and now he's wondering. And I said, oh no, Bishop, I'm Vermont's response to mission. Well, he bought that. And that was a 5-year contract, which he signed, and which I had to sign with the superior of the Maryknoll Fathers.
And so you signed on for?
I signed on for 5 years again.
So then where did you end up this time?
This time, I ended up at Maryknoll headquarters in New York. And I opened an office. I was coordinator of a Justice and Peace office there at Maryknoll headquarters.
No, Justice and Peace?
Yes.
Now, what was that?
That was an open effort to speak to the countries where the Maryknollers were living.
Right.
Which were, for the most part, very poor countries. And the effort of the Justice and Peace Office was to facilitate their dealings with the people and the government and the governments
right.
of those areas, and to assist in, economic as well as spiritual growth and development.
Right.
So that was an interesting part of my existence. And then I went to Washington again, this time in the Office of International Justice and Peace, with my background from Peru.
Right.
I had a new world in Washington. That didn't last very long, but the office itself is part of the Bishops' Conference, and I spent a period of time there.
Right.
And after that, my 5 years were up, and Bishop Marshall said, "Time to get back to Vermont." Yes, Bishop.
So when the bishop speaks, the priests have to listen.
We make a promise to the bishop of obedience, and he asks. Sometimes, in the old days, they would ask you if you were interested in A, B, or C, as far as parishes or assignments. But in the old days, you just got a letter in the mail and said you've been assigned from Richford, for example, to Catholic University. And with Bishop Marshall, when I came back, I was right. I had an office there, the communication in his.
Oh, so you went back to his office?
Yes, I had an office in the Chancery in those days. It was in Burlington.
Right.
The building has long since been sold. It was right by what was then the Gosbrian, which was the Catholic hospital.
Right.
In Burlington for many years.
Right. So when did you eventually arrive up in the Northeast Kingdom?
Well, back and forth all the time.
Oh, okay.
Every hours.
Right.
We always had a car. The priest always had a car.
Right.
Well, in the beginning, though, that was held up also for a period of time. But
you couldn't fly. Like, I think you once told me that, especially when you became a new priest, you couldn't be too flamboyant, because didn't you once tell me something about Father St. Ange's had a flashy convertible? And
yes.
Now, what was that story? Something about, didn't you borrow it once or something? And
one of the things that the bishop apparently was upset that some of his priests were driving convertibles. He didn't think that was the proper priestly car. And when Father Senos saw that, I arrived without a car. He said, "Can you drive a car?" And, "Yes, Father." "You have a license?" "Yes, I have a license to drive a car." "Well, where's your car?" I said, "Well, we can't have one for 6 months." So he called the Chancery to find out if how I was supposed to get from Richford down to East Berkshire, was the mission in those days.
Right.
And so he went to St. Albans at that time and came back with a convertible. It was a year old, but it was a fancy
right.
Oldsmobile convertible. And of course, he had to, if I was going to go to there was a farmer that was dying of cancer at that time. He gave me the keys to his car. And then he came by with a new Plymouth station wagon. He called it a bitch wagon.
Now, why is that?
Well, the beach wagon idea.
Oh.
I'm presuming that was what it was. And the housekeeper said, well, what are you going to do with that? Well, we're going to take the stuff to the dump. And I said, Father, am I going to be able to drive that? Well, yes, if you put gas in it. So he was helpful, and he gave me, little gas money to use because of the parish visits and all. But I think that he probably felt that the bishop shouldn't be telling us what kind of a car to drive.
So he got a what? What kind of car was it?
It was an Oldsmobile, baby blue convertible.
Convertible.
And then he traded that in for a small sports car.
Right.
In the 2 years I was with him, I think he had 7 different cars.
And so what do you think the bishop today then would think, since he didn't really want to see you guys with a sports car?
No.
What would he think about Father Royer going around on his motorcycle today?
Well, my guess is he'd say, well, that's good. He's saving money doing that. Because we have a few of the priests do have motorcycles.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Father Royer, as you say.
Yep. I know I went up to him one day. We were talking over at the hospital. I said, Father Royer, you're from a big hunting family. He says, yep. I says, do priests really hunt? He says, oh yeah. He says, I go out hunting. And he says, I also drive a motorcycle. And because for some reason I didn't picture a priest walking around in the woods with a gun. But
okay.
But
they do most things that everybody else does.
Yeah, because my only experience at that time with a priest or with a minister when I was younger is you saw you guys up on the pulpit. We didn't see the rest of the week. So now, have you enjoyed being a priest throughout the years?
Oh, it's been wonderful.
Right.
It's been a wonderful life.
You ever thought about how many funerals and how many weddings you've done? You must have done hundreds, haven't you?
Yeah, sure. I've never counted.
Right.
But it's because we enter into the lives of families without the responsibility of a personal family.
Right.
With a very special role. And that's been a very gratifying one and a grace-filled one for me over the years. And then the Latin American experience was a whole new enrichment to my priestly life with a new culture, a new concept of church.
If you hadn't become a priest, if you had to go back in time and you hadn't become a priest, what do you think you would be?
Well, now that's a good question. Since my mother was a school teacher, and my several aunts and uncles, my guess is I would have probably got into teaching also.
Right.
Because I ended up as a principal of a school, and I taught there too. I probably, had I not been in the priesthood, I'd probably been in education somewhere or other.
I think one thing, to me, as a non-Catholic, to me, it would seem like the biggest struggle that people must face when they're considering going into the priesthood is not being able to marry and not being able to have children. Did that ever come into your thoughts when you were?
Oh, sure. Oh, I think that any candidate that knows that celibacy is an integral part of priesthood and has been done through the centuries, even though, who knows, maybe someday it'll be an option. But, I think we all face up to that decision. and then ultimately say, okay, with God's grace and help and strength, I can.
I was speaking to one of your African counterparts once. I was sitting at a table with them, and we were talking about how over where he was from, I think he started looking at the priesthood even younger than you, and he said they have many years where they're expected to ask themselves throughout their training and whether this is the thing for me. They said because they don't, they want people who are truly committed, and he did say that's the one thing that they lost a lot of candidates because they got to the point where no, we can't live our lives. But he said that by the time they become priests, they know
they're
their
committed
journey.
and made a decision.
Right.
Well, in my own experience, of the 36 of us that started in the early high school years,
Right.
only 6 of them were ordained.
Mm-hmm.
So the decisions are made along the way, and there's a dropout rate which would be high.
Right.
But I think that those of us that pursue and go through are given special helps.
Right.
And a support system that starts with our own families, of course.
Right. Well, in the Davignon family, I think there's a whole clan of you. So I'm sure I'm sure you must have some nephews and nieces that are kind of like your own in a sense.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I have 22 nieces and nephews,
Right.
to be exact.
Yeah. And do you almost view yourself as a fatherly figure to some of them?
That's a good question.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Right.
I know they see me as an uncle,
Right.
and they all have their own mothers and fathers, of course.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Are you able to provide your own family with spiritual guidance, or are you still like Charles, or are you able to provide them with a level of spiritual?
Well, I'm certainly Charles to all of them.
Right.
Father Charles from those early days. Hopefully, there's also at least an example.
Right.
And the assistance of being with the family, where there must be some spiritual growth and
Right.
assistance there.
Right.
At least I hope.
Right. Now, was St. Mary's Star of the Sea Church, was that one of your more beautiful churches you've worked in?
Oh, no doubt about it.
Right.
Yeah, the Cathedral of the Northeast, and actually that was my first parish because I had been in South America and I'd been in the university work and all that. But oh yes, the church here in Newport is one of the outstanding ones in the Diocese of Burlington.
And I understand when it was actually built, you actually had a strong-willed priest who actually kind of took, well, I wouldn't say he built it first, then asked, but the story goes that it isn't exactly the way it was. It wasn't supposed to be so grand.
That's right, and the original church is there.
Right.
Which was the KC Hall.
Right.
And the second Bishop of Burlington, and I think this goes back to 1873. I think he was the pastor there. And then Father Claremont is the one that visualized this beautiful place up on top of the hill. And I think he borrowed money for all that.
Right.
And there was some conflict that
Right.
certainly went into the construction and the ultimate dedication of the church.
Right.
The cornerstone of St. Mary's was laid in, I think, in 1904.
Right.
And then when it was finally dedicated, conspicuous by their absence were the founding pastor and the Bishop of Burlington. The bishop that came down to dedicate the new church was from, I don't know, Sherbrooke but Canada anyway.
Right. Okay, on to another topic. It's tough and it's a painful chapter. The Catholic Church has faced challenges throughout the last, decade or two. Can the Catholic Church survive all of this?
I certainly hope so.
Right.
But it's been a very difficult and an embarrassing time
Right.
with all this abuse,
Right.
sex abuse.
Right.
And the history of the church, of course, it goes back for 2,000 years. So they've faced difficulties over the years. My prayer and my hope would be that having faced up to it now, we will obviously accept the blame, which is real, but hopefully also we'll have overcome the problems of this whole embarrassing and painful and sinful reality.
And when you're, like, still to this day, when I see a priest, I still have I still see a special person. Do you think people now look at you and your clerical collar differently, or do you still think people might not even be believers, but they know you are a special person? Do you feel that has changed?
That's a good question, too. I certainly think that maybe we were on a pedestal that we did not deserve.
Right.
And if we've come down off that pedestal, that's a blessing. Hopefully, it's not just a collar.
Right. Yeah, but I think that's what makes you special. And, I have limited contact with different priests, but I use you and I use Father Royer as examples of, if you stood too high on your pedestal, there would be people who knew you growing up and everything who were more than happy to give you a little push off your pedestal. But it kept you humble.
Maybe so.
And I think that's why the two of you really had a true connection with people, because if you got too lofty,
Too uppity.
and you are normal people, but
Well, that's kind of you, Scott.
Yeah.
I would hope that other folks would also see us
Right.
as down to earth and one with them.
Right. Yeah, and that's it, because so you're hopeful that this too will pass, but
Yes, very much so.
right. But on the other hand, I'm sure, I think the Catholic Church has, what happened was horrible, but it seems like they're trying to really make amends for it.
Oh, I think so.
Right.
And I think that they perhaps have even given example to other parts of the society.
Right.
Because we hear this in the sports world and the Boy Scouts and all of those other areas where abuse is also,
Right.
I don't know if it's common, but we certainly know that there's
Right.
areas. But I think the church, having faced it and having taken forceful means to correct the difficulties that I think we will continue to improve and even hopefully set an example to the rest of the church and to the rest of society.
Okay, here's another difficult one. It must be so heart-wrenching. Like, you've worked in parishes that are no longer, the churches have closed. That must be so hard for you and the families to have to close a church.
Oh, yes.
Because, so much of your life, if you're a churchgoer, so much of your life is there. That's where births were celebrated, deaths were mourned, and then to have to close.
Oh, that's very difficult. And that's been true not only in our own diocese. Growing up, the four churches that were Barton, Orleans, Irisburg, and East Albany, there were priests in all those places. Now we have one that's doing that. So, well, you mentioned Paul Daniels.
Right.
The one in East Albany is open twice a year. So, yes, those are difficult decisions.
Oh, I would imagine it would be. Now, what year did you retire at?
Well, when I was 70.
Right.
But then I went back to work.
Right.
So I retired again in 2009. What was I then? I must have been I must have been 79 again.
Right. But retirement for you is different than retirement for me, I believe, which I probably never will retire. But I once asked you, I said, well, retirement, does that mean you can now go get married? And you assured me that wasn't the case. What does retirement mean for a priest?
It means that you are freed of the responsibility of running a parish or a parish school in my earlier years. But it doesn't mean that you give up your spiritual responsibility to assist and be a part of the life of a parish.
Right.
So, in my case, it gives me a freedom to go to Florida, for example, in the wintertime, which I've done the last few years.
Right.
But I get connected down there also with the local parish.
Right.
And if they need assistance, we're free and open to assist.
Right.
But it gives you. I'm living at the home farm, for example,
Right.
now.
Are you back to
What am I
milking
saying?
cows?
No cows.
Oh, no cows.
No animals. No dogs. No cats.
Really?
A few mice, though.
Okay. Now on to the world stage. Were you surprised when word came out that Pope Benedict had stepped down?
I was surprised, and I was delighted.
Oh, really?
Well, in the sense that the world saw poor John Paul II with his Parkinson's and everything. He suffered before the world, and I think was probably giving an example of suffering in the
Right.
presence of Christ himself. But for a pope to resign, and he's an old man, recognizing his own diminishing capabilities, I was pleased to see him submit his resignation to the world. That was I don't know, at the moment, pardon me, I don't know what he's up to,
Right.
but I'm sure that he's a prayerful man. He's a very intelligent man. It was an example for any of us to say, wait a minute, I can't go till I'm 100.
Right. And he also had it was also a difficult period for him. Well, Pope John Paul, he was, a very colorful, very kind of flamboyant priest in a sense,
yes.
and very beloved, but also then, so Pope Benedict seemed to have a lot of differences, and he had to deal with this, what ended up kind of being a global scandal that they had to work on, and it seems like he really had a tough time of it.
Oh, I think he did too. And I think he did. And that might have been one of the reasons why he thought it was important to resign.
Right.
They used the word abdicate,
Right.
Which that seems more royalty, or
Right.
But anyway, no, I think he had a tough time.
Right.
He was a different personality.
Right.
I'm impressed with this new man.
I was going to say, I think he's a little bit molded out of you. I think he may have been taking some advice from you, this new one.
I haven't had the chance to give it to him. But he comes from a different mold, I think.
Very humble.
Yes. Humble, simplicity, accessibility.
Right.
Yeah, I'm impressed with Pope Francis.
Right.
Even the choice of the name.
Right. And I had to ask my minister. I have a couple minister friends, and I had to ask them. I said, "What is the Jesuits?"
Jesuits.
And that's the order he's from.
Yes.
And explain what, because there's been a lot of, I imagine even Catholics who didn't know what that all meant. What is
the Jesuits?
Right.
There are a number of religious communities
Right.
in the church, like St. Francis and the Franciscans, St. Dominic and the Dominicans. St. Ignatius of Loyola was in the 1500s,
right.
who was a military man in the beginning, and then became convinced that the Lord was calling him, and he invited other people to follow him, and the Society of Jesus is the official title
Right.
of these men who are called Jesuits, and they had been outstanding missionaries. They came from Europe into New York, for example, that came to the conversion of the Indians in our own country. They're very much involved with higher education. I don't know how many of our big universities in the United States today are run by the Jesuits, Boston College being one, Holy Cross in Worcester, Mass, here in New England.
No,
Well, but anyway, he was a Jesuit and is one,
right.
having been the Cardinal Archbishop down in Argentina.
Right.
But he's certainly given already a more accessible approach, I think.
Right. So where do you think he will take the church?
Oh, I think he'll take it to the common man,
Right.
and that will be his gift, knowing that everyone is involved in the church and its growth, and he will reach out and is doing so already.
Right.
In the first 100 days of his papacy.
Right. That seems like such a challenging job to be the Pope.
Oh, it's got to be. Almost an impossible task.
Yeah, have you ever been to the Vatican?
Oh, yes, I have. Several times.
Have you ever had a chance to meet any of the popes that you've served under?
I've been to papal audiences.
Right.
I never got close enough to shake hands with them. But,
So how did it feel as a priest to be at the Vatican?
oh, it feels as if you're at the core of things. You're at the heart of the church. It was a good feeling.
Right. Yeah. Hey, let's come back to the Northeast Kingdom. You know, as you know, I record history, and that's how come I wanted
you do,
I wanted
Scott.
to
That's
sit
good.
down here with you, and that's how come. And I always ask questions like, why? Like when you in your generation, you know, which is my parents' generation, there was this real, sometimes tension within communities of the Protestants and the Catholics. In a generation that is a little bit older than you, there actually used to be cross burnings here against the French Catholics because you were coming here and stealing our jobs. Did you ever feel any of that community tension when you were growing up?
Oh, well, I went to grammar school in Brownington.
Right.
And our neighbors were Protestants.
Right.
But friendly.
Right.
But also, oh, sure. There were a couple of the Gallup family. They were Gallups.
Yeah.
Next to us.
Yeah.
And Genevieve and Jeanette. We were classmates, but we'd have battles on the way home from school. and I think there was a kind of a tension there.
Right. Yeah, because even until the 80s, and maybe even today, if you were a good Catholic or if you were a good Protestant, well, it was okay to be friends across. But you know, when it came to the marriage, there were still, and I imagine there still are some families today that, you know, if you're a devout Catholic or you're a devout Protestant, well, you know, it's okay to be friends across lines, but let's leave it at that.
I think that it's much less so. I think the tensions have,
right,
because so many of our own families are married into mixed religion.
right.
So I think that the antagonism of the past is hopefully gone.
But you said your parents were kind of were progressive in the sense. I remember you told me that you could even, like I've talked to some Catholic friends who or Catholic people I've interviewed that their parents wouldn't even let them go into a Protestant church, but your parents were different.
Well, I remember in Evansville, Vermont,
Right.
Our school Christmas play was in the church.
Right.
So, there certainly was a open-mindedness, at least,
Right.
that came from from home, and my parents who were open to.
Right.
But I would hope that antagonism of the past has gone for good.
Right. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, because you know you might be going about things different, but I think your mission is pretty much the same.
Yes.
Between the different religions of Christianity.
Oh, sure.
Right. Well, you know what I notice is I spend a lot of time in nursing homes for a variety of reasons. My mother's recuperating, but I also do history in the nursing homes, and it's really caused me to believe that must be this. I never really thought about it, but at least at one point, this must be had been a huge Catholic area, because I go into so many of the rooms of the older folks, and there's Mary, the Virgin Mary.
A statue.
Right, and I go in there so often, and it seems like the 80, 90s and above, the predominant numbers of them are Catholic.
That's interesting.
Right.
We,
Maybe you just live longer.
I don't know about that, but if so, we're open, I think, to be a part of the real world, and thank God for it.
Right. Hey, I'm gonna ask you a very foolish question, because I'm not afraid to ask. You're a teacher. They said that there's the only dumb question is the one that isn't asked. Is when I grew up, you had your sisters here that had the habbocks on and everything, and they looked like sisters. And now I was over at the nursing home, and occasionally one will come in, and she's all dressed up like a regular person off the street.
Yes.
Was that a different order of sisters, or is it just change?
Well, I think it's development. After the Second Vatican Council, which was
Right.
between 1962 and 1965, and under Pope John the 23rd,
Right.
he gave a new thrust to the church, and he said we've got to let the air in, and there were so many previous restrictions that I think he opened the door to a greater freedom, and the religious habit was one of them for many. It was a modified thing in the beginning,
Right.
and then some have not, maintained it at all. Although no, there's a group of sisters that have come in recently here to Newport that are wearing the religious habit.
Right.
But I think that was an accidental, really, not a substantive change.
Right. I'm sure some of our Catholic viewers are sitting here thinking, why doesn't he know these things? But as I said, for me, being non-Catholic, is a lot of this stuff is new. But that's how come I love to record history, because I get to ask these questions. Because
you do a good job.
I love to know. I can sit down. You do know there's not a person walking this earth who does not have a story to tell.
That's true.
Right. If you had to think of a person that really was awe-inspiring to you, that you've met, who would that be?
Oh gosh, there'd be so many of them. I guess some of my own teachers,
Right.
From the elementary level, and then during my seminary career, so many of them. My own relatives, my aunts and uncles, who were an example to us. My own parents.
I appreciate your answers, because a lot of people would say presidents, sports stars, but I think very often the simple people and the awe-inspiring lives that they have led. It's like, that's how come I like to interview people like you, because I look at you and I could never have walked in your shoes, but I look at you as just like a true icon to the area.
Oh, aren't you nice? Thank you.
So, all right, we only have about 5 more minutes left. What would you like to tell the viewers about yourself, or what do you plan on doing for the remainder of your days?
Well, now that's a good question, and I frequently, even in my daily prayer, and I think of my mother who would have prayed even in a time of difficulty, because my brother and I had polio as boys.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I remember my mother's prayer being, God's holy will. This is God's holy will. It was a very difficult time for her. And I wake up now at 82. I'm quite healthy, thank God. And I ask myself now, Lord, what do you want of me today? What do you want me to do? What do you want me to be other than what I'm doing? God, what's your will? And I guess that's on a daily basis, knowing that He's given me the gift of life, He's given me the gift of grace, He's given me the gift of family, and I say, okay, I'll do whatever you want. You have some surprises for me? Because I think ours is a God of surprises. So I think He says, I'll surprise you.
Who do you,
Again this morning.
how do you want people to remember you when you're gone?
Oh.
Tough question, huh?
Oh, that one is. I hope that they remember me as a faithful priest and servant of the Lord who did his best in whatever gifts or lack thereof that he had. As someone who opened his life to the people around his world, and that became a lot of the world in my case.
And I think humble. I think humble fits in there too.
Oh, I hope.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for taking the time out of your day for coming on the show, and I've been looking forward to it.
Thank you, Scott.
All right.
Well, I want to thank you too for having me again. I enjoyed the radio time. I've enjoyed this today as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.